This major US comedian really felt that in fact he could snap his fingers and indeed the royals would come running. I kid you not. But this story is quite a sad story in fact, because it was a man who literally had the world at his feet, made so many millions of people laugh, and more importantly ended up, well, quite a tragic end. As ever, let me explain. Hi, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for your time. You all right today? Many people know this man, well, really, as one name, isn't it? Bilko. Sergeant Bilko, the fast-talking con guy that literally enamored audiences, millions, for many years, not just over in the American channels, but around the world. He was one of those powerhouses of mega fun. Now, what was interesting was, as I often say here on the show, I know, but I've been lucky enough to meet so many people who worked with these people. And one of those was none other than the very beautiful singer, actress and carry-on star, Anita Harris. Been a good friend for many years. By the way, if you can just send prayers and good wishes, Anita recently managed to sprain her ankle while trying to sidestep a buggy over here in the very heart of London and lost her balance. Terrible thing. Yes, I know. Well, she's a lady of, I mean this nicely. She's reached a lovely age. But the thing is, it's just one simple move like that, isn't it? Anita, though, we hope that you're going to be back on your feet very soon. But back to your story. You see, now, Phil Silvers had met His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, on a couple of occasions previously on visits to London in the 1950s. But by the middle 60s, his star was, shall we say, slightly waning. So the producers of the very funny Carry On films decided that they were going to book him to appear in their mega movie, Follow That Camel, a usual sort of plethora of the repertory theatre of Carry On stars, including Anita. Now, here's where it got really tricky, you see, because Phil was very demanding, there's no two ways about it. And he wanted £30,000, which was a lot of money up front in 1967, plus, of course, a suite at the Savoy for the duration and all expenses. Now, what really emerged on this particular film, it wasn't really just necessarily all expenses. Phil was a chronic gambler. And, you know, very sad when you think about it, because, of course, he was the brilliant comedian. There's no two ways about that. But what was also interesting was the fact that while the rest of the cast were only getting £5,000 for the full 6-week duration of filming, which in fact was at Camber Sands and then over on Southport Beach in Lancashire, well, Phil naturally travelled in mass comfort in a car. They had to slum it on public transport on occasions, going out to Pinewood Studios. You see how this works. Now, because of course Phil's ego, shall we say, he felt that, once the royals knew that he was in town, and particularly staying at the Savoy, well, naturally they'd want to come by and say hello. The producer, Peter Rogers, and Gerald Thomas tried to point out, well, it doesn't really work like that, Mr. Silvers, you know, it wasn't really the right thing to do. But no, Phil insisted that once, if they got message to the palace, that in fact His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, would pop along, even coming down to Camber Sands to watch him film. Such a fan of Bilko was he. And it's true, Prince Philip did love the comedy Sergeant Bilko, not enough though to travel to Camber Sands. Now, here's where it gets really quite tragic, because when you think about it, as I say, this man was one of the biggest stars for many years, but he also refused to learn his lines on set, and so they had cue cards just off camera. He said he couldn't be bothered to learn them, and the fact that they were changing them all the time. But more importantly, as Anita very tactfully pointed out to me, he felt he could write funnier lines himself, and so there was a bit of a clash as to which lines they were going to say. So by putting it on cue cards, they were under no, well, shall we just say, he had to do what he was told. But moving forward, I also was lucky enough to meet Kenneth Williams, and he was a wonderful guy as well, you know, had his demons, as many people know. And Kenneth told me that he found it very hard to work with Phil Silvers, simply because Phil just did everything to take over the power. Stand in your key light, try and throw you off, smirk when the camera was on you so that you'd laugh. He wanted the attention full time. Now, the sad thing is that according to that well-placed source, and I can't say which one now, well, the £30,000 was squandered away on gambling. He was such a chronic gambler that he then started to ask secretly members of the Carry On cast, could they loan him this, £20, £40, £50, all that sort of stuff. He didn't matter where he was, he had to go and gamble it. And so by the end of this movie, where he should have been very rich and back on his feet again, the bulk of it had gone. which is really sad when you think, isn't it? You know, let's be honest. Now, Prince Philip, no, sadly, he never did make it to Camber Sands, or he never made it out to Pinewood Studios to see his pal, of course, Phil Silvers. One might suspect that maybe he knew of the problems that were now engulfing Phil, and it never really stopped. He came back over to London in the early 70s, appearing in a provincial effort called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. Big success, but once again kind of blew the money very quickly, and so much so that the driver who was looking after him at the Savoy was told not to go even anywhere near what looked like a betting shop in case he jumped out. How sad that it could be that bad. But as Anita Harris said, what you saw on screen was absolute magic, and she was absolutely thrilled to work with him. The stories of him working on Something's Got to Give with Dean Martin and Marilyn Monroe and all the other wonderful people that he worked with, she said was worth, as she very tactfully put, the ego alone. Either way, people will now remember Sergeant Bilko with affection. But the demons behind, of course, the comic genius that was Phil Silvers, well, not many people would have known just what he went through to make all of us laugh. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.